Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Ram Dass, the wandering sage who traded psychology for the eternal present. Together and apart, they trace the boundaries between healing and awakening, between the symbolic and the sacred, between depth and devotion. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approached the transformation of consciousness, one seeing the psyche as a cosmos of archetypes, demanding integration, the other discovering the self as an illusion to be surrendered in the presence of the beloved. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most: the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Ram Dass as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. In the summer of 1961, as the Western world trembled between old certainties and new visions, a young professor of psychology sat in a suburban living room and swallowed a small white pill. His name was Richard Alpert. He was 30 years old, impeccably credentialed, ambitious, and secretly desperate. He taught at Harvard University, published papers, wore tweed jackets, and drove a Mercedes. He had accumulated the markers of success like a man building a fortress against emptiness. That summer evening, as lysergic acid diethylamide dissolved into his bloodstream, the fortress began to crumble. The walls between self and world grew transparent. The carefully constructed identity of Richard Alpert, psychologist, began to shimmer and fade like morning mist, and in that dissolving, something ancient and nameless stirred. Half a world away and half a century earlier, in the elegant consulting rooms of Zurich, Switzerland, another young man had faced his own dissolution. Carl Jung, in the years following his break with Sigmund Freud, had descended into what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious. Between 1913 and 1919, Jung experienced visions, heard voices, and conversed with inner figures who seemed to possess their own autonomous existence. He did not use chemical substances to induce these experiences. They came unbidden, flooding through the rupture left by his separation from his mentor and father figure. Jung recorded these encounters in his Red Book, painting and writing his way through a landscape of symbols and archetypal presences. Where Richard Alpert would later journey to India to find his teacher, Jung journeyed inward to find his own depths. These two men, born 60 years apart, would never meet in the flesh. Jung died in 1961, the same year Alpert first encountered psychedelics, yet their paths traced complementary arcs through the geography of consciousness, each seeking what the other had found differently. Both were educated in the Western scientific tradition. Both became disenchanted with that tradition's limitations. Both sought direct experience of dimensions that psychology textbooks could not capture. And both would spend decades attempting to communicate what they had discovered, translating the ineffable into words, though the words each chose reflected profoundly different orientations toward the sacred. Jung was born in 18, 75, in the small Swiss village of Keswil, the son of a Protestant pastor whose faith had grown hollow with doubt. The young Carl grew up in a household shadowed by his father's religious despair and his mother's mysterious dual personality. She was, Jung recalled, two people, a conventional housewife by day and a figure of uncanny wisdom by night, speaking in a voice that seemed to come from depths beyond her ordinary consciousness. This early encounter with the multiplicity within the self would shape Jung's entire psychological vision. He learned Jung that a person is not a single thing, but a congress of voices, a parliament of selves. As a medical student, and then as a young psychiatrist at the Burgholzli Hospital in Zurich, Jung studied what science then knew of the mind. He worked with schizophrenic patients, using word association tests to map the hidden complexes that erupted in their speech. He read widely in mythology, religion, and philosophy, seeking patterns that might illuminate his patients' seemingly chaotic symptoms. When he encountered Freud's work on dreams and the unconscious, Jung felt he had found a kindred spirit, someone else who dared to look beneath the surface of consciousness. Their collaboration, intense and productive, lasted from 1907 to 1913. But beneath the partnership, differences were growing. Freud saw the unconscious as primarily personal, a repository of repressed wishes and traumatic memories. He interpreted religious experience as sublimated sexuality, mystical visions as regression to infantile longings. Jung, influenced by his study of mythology and his own inner experiences, began to sense something else, a layer of psyche that was not personal, but transpersonal, not merely repressed, but eternally present, a collective unconscious shared by all humanity and populated by archetypal figures, the Great Mother, the Wise Old Man, the Shadow, the Anima and Animus, images that appeared across cultures and epochs with remarkable consistency. The break between Jung and Freud was bitter and painful, leaving Jung in a state of profound disorientation. He resigned from his academic positions and turned inward, deliberately opening himself to the unconscious contents that had been pressing against the boundaries of his awareness. In this experimental madness, Jung discovered his method. He would not suppress these inner voices and visions. Instead, he would engage them, question them, paint them, record them. He called this active imagination, a technique of conscious participation with unconscious contents. He emerged from this period with a new understanding. The psyche is not merely a collection of past experiences, but a living, self-organizing system oriented toward wholeness. He called this process individuation, the journey toward the self, which was not the ego but the totality that includes and transcends ego consciousness. By the time Richard Alpert, that was born in 1931 in Boston, Massachusetts, Jung had established himself as one of the great psychological theorists of the 20th century. His work on psychological types, the collective unconscious, synchronicity, and the relationship between psychology and religion had made him both famous and controversial. The psychoanalytic establishment often dismissed him as mystical and unscientific. Academic psychology, increasingly behaviorist and materialist, had little room for talk of archetypes and spiritual dimensions. But Jung had found his audience among those who sensed that the human psyche was more mysterious and more meaningful than mechanistic theories allowed. Richard Alpert grew up in a very different world from Jung's 19th century Swiss village. He was the son of a successful Jewish lawyer who later became president of the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad. The family was affluent, assimilated, and secular. Young Richard excelled academically, driven by a need to prove himself, to achieve, to accumulate the symbols of worldly success. He studied psychology at Tufts, Wesleyan, and Stanford, earning his doctorate in 1957. His dissertation was on achievement motivation. By 1961, he had appointments at Harvard, publications, research grants. He had therapy to manage his anxieties. He had a sports car and a Cessna airplane. He had a carefully managed secret gay life in an era when such things required careful management. And underneath all of it, he felt empty. The 60s were beginning to stir with possibilities Jung had never imagined. Chemical compounds synthesized in laboratories were offering, it seemed, direct access to altered states of consciousness. Aldous Huxley had written The Doors of Perception, describing his mescaline experiences as revelations of mind at large, a vast consciousness normally filtered down to the narrow stream of ordinary awareness. Timothy Leary, Alpert's colleague at Harvard, had encountered psychedelic mushrooms in Mexico and returned convinced they were tools for psychological revolution. When Alpert first took psilocybin in 1961, he experienced what he would later describe as meeting himself without his personality. The Richard, who was a professor, who worried about tenure, who performed a certain social identity, all of that became transparent, revealed as costume rather than essence. Behind the costume was something else, a witnessing awareness that felt more fundamental than any thought or feeling. This was intoxicating and terrifying. It suggested that everything he had built his life around was superficial, that there was a reality beneath or beyond the world of achievement and anxiety. Jung would have understood this dissolution of the persona, the social mask we wear. He had written extensively about how identification with the persona leads to psychological crisis, how the mask must eventually be recognized as mask. But Jung's method was gradual, proceeding through dream work and active imagination, building a relationship between ego and unconscious. The psychedelic experience, by contrast, was sudden, overwhelming, a flood rather than a conversation. Alpert and Leary, in their excitement, saw this as an advantage. Why spend years in analysis when a few hours on a substance could reveal the truth? Over the next few years, Alpert and Leary conducted research with psilocybin at Harvard, studying its effects on prisoners, divinity students, and volunteers. Their research was controversial from the start. They were accused of lacking proper controls, of being advocates rather than neutral scientists, of taking the substances themselves and losing objectivity. By 1963, both had been dismissed from Harvard, making them martyrs to those who believed psychedelics were keys to consciousness and cautionary tales to those who saw them as dangerous disruptions of psychological stability. If Jung had been alive to witness this, what would he have thought? We know something of his views because he did comment on mescaline and other consciousness-altering substances. His position was nuanced and cautious. He acknowledged that such experiences could produce genuine encounters with archetypal material, that they might break through the defenses of a rigid ego and open awareness to dimensions normally unconscious. But he was deeply concerned about the lack of container, the absence of symbolic framework and integrative process. To flood the psyche with contents it is not prepared to receive, Jung believed, risked inflation, psychosis, or simply a spectacular experience that changes nothing fundamental because it has not been integrated into the personality. There is a letter Jung wrote in 1954 to a correspondent asking about mescaline. Jung wrote that anything approaching such substances should be done with the greatest caution because they forced open the door to the unconscious without proper preparation. He compared it to breaking into a house rather than being invited in. The contents encountered might be genuine, he said, but the relationship to them was wrong. It was passive, receptive without being active, visionary without being integrative. Jung's entire method was based on the ego gradually developing the capacity to relate to unconscious contents, to hold the tension between opposites, to suffer the transformation that comes from sustained engagement with inner figures and conflicts. But Richard Alpert in 1963 was not interested in gradual development. He was interested in liberation. He had glimpsed something beyond psychological, something that felt spiritual rather than merely symbolic. The psychedelic experiences had shown him that consciousness could be radically different from ordinary awareness. They had given him a taste of what Eastern traditions called enlightenment or awakening, but the effects were temporary. The experiences ended, and he returned to being Richard Alpert with his anxieties and emptiness and questions. In 1967, feeling that psychedelics had taken him as far as they could, Alpert traveled to India. He was seeking a more stable way of accessing the consciousness he had briefly touched. India in the late 60s was becoming a destination for Western seekers, young people disenchanted with materialism and drawn to ancient traditions promising liberation. Alpert wandered through the subcontinent, visiting temples and ashrams, trying meditation and yoga, but nothing struck deeply. He was still Richard, the Western academic, observing spiritual practices from outside. Then, in the foothills of the Himalayas, he met a young Western man named Bhagavan Das, who radiated something. Alpert recognized a quality of presence, of being at home in the moment. Alpert followed him to a small temple where an old man wrapped in a blanket sat on a wooden bench. This was Neem Karoli Baba, the guru Alpert would call Maharaji. Their first meeting became the pivotal moment of Alpert's life, the story he would tell thousands of times. Maharaji, without introduction, began speaking about Alpert's mother, who had died the previous year. He described her death from spleen illness, her transition, details Alpert had told no one in India. He spoke of Alpert's grief, which Alpert had carefully hidden. The old man seemed to know everything, to see through all masks and pretenses. Then Maharaji held out his hand and asked for medicine. Confused, Alpert gave him a small white pill, a tablet of LSD he had brought to India. Maharaji took it, then asked for more. Alpert gave him 2 more pills. Maharaji swallowed all 3 tablets, an enormous dose, equivalent to 900 micrograms, and continued sitting, talking, laughing, showing no effects whatsoever. The substance that had shattered Alpert's reality seemed to touch this man not at all. This encounter demolished Alpert's faith in psychedelics as the answer. If this old man could embody the consciousness Alpert had only glimpsed chemically, and if that consciousness was unaffected by massive doses of LSD, then clearly there was a state of being that transcended drug experiences. Maharaji later told Alpert that the medicine was useful for visiting Christ, for opening the heart temporarily, but that it would not bring lasting transformation. For that, different practices were needed. Alpert stayed in India, studying with Maharaji and practicing bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion. He was given a new name, Ram Das, Servant of God, specifically Servant of Ram, the incarnation of Vishnu. The name marked a death and a birth. Richard Alpert, the anxious achiever, was meant to die. Ram Dass, the devotee, was meant to emerge. Where Jung had individuated through confrontation with inner figures, Ram Dass was attempting liberation through surrender to an outer figure, a guru whose being seemed to embody something beyond personality. This represents one of the fundamental divergences between Jung and the path Ram Dass found. Jung was deeply suspicious of gurus and external spiritual authorities. He had seen how easily people projected their own inner wisdom onto charismatic teachers, endowing them with powers and knowledge that properly belonged to the self within. Jung believed that wholeness came from integrating the opposites within one's own psyche, from owning one's shadow and developing one's capacities. To surrender to an external authority, no matter how enlightened, was to risk remaining a child, forever dependent on the teacher's presence. The guru-disciple relationship in Eastern tradition serves a different function than the analyst-patient relationship in Jungian psychology. The guru is not meant to help the disciple integrate their personality. The guru is meant to help the disciple recognize that their personality is illusory, that the separate self they take to be real is a construct, and that their true nature is identical with the Absolute, with Brahman, with the ground of being. This recognition is not a psychological achievement, but a spiritual awakening, a shift in identity from ego to something that transcends ego entirely. Jung would have called this inflation, a dangerous identification with the self rather than proper relationship to it. He distinguished carefully between the ego, the center of consciousness, and the self, the totality of psyche, including conscious and unconscious. The self is experienced as numinous, as divine, but it is also impersonal, archetypal, and overwhelming if the ego is not strong enough to maintain its own position in relation to it. Individuation, for Jung, meant the ego learning to orbit the self, to serve it without being swallowed by it. The goal was not to dissolve the ego, but to right-size it, to help it know its place in the larger economy of the psyche. Ram Dass, trained in the Hindu understanding he received from his guru, saw the ego itself as the problem, the separate self-sense, the I that feels itself divided from the world, from others, from God. This was understood not as something to be strengthened and then properly related to a larger self, but as an illusion to be seen through. The practices Ram Dass learned, meditation, mantra, service, devotion, were designed to weaken ego boundaries, to reveal their constructed nature, to allow awareness to shift from identification with thoughts and feelings to identification with the witnessing awareness that observes thoughts and feelings. When Ram Dass returned to the West in 1969, he brought this teaching. His book, Be Here Now, published in 1971, became a countercultural phenomenon, selling millions of copies. Its message was simple and radical. You are not who you think you are. The roles you play, the anxieties you suffer, the achievements you pursue, all of this is theater. Behind the drama is a presence, an awareness that is eternally here, eternally now, untouched by the content of experience. To realize this is liberation. The book was divided into sections. Journey, which told Alpert's transformation into Ram Dass, From Bindu to Ojas, a psychedelic handbook of spiritual concepts drawn from Hinduism and Buddhism, and Cookbook for a Sacred Life, practical instructions for meditation, diet, and spiritual practice. It was irreverent, playful, illustrated with brown ink drawings and calligraphic text. It spoke the language of the 60s counterculture while transmitting teachings from ancient traditions. It made Eastern spirituality accessible to a generation of young Americans seeking alternatives to the psychological and spiritual emptiness they associated with mainstream Western culture. Jung had engaged extensively with Eastern philosophy, particularly with texts like the I Ching, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and the yogic traditions. He wrote commentaries and forewords for translations of Eastern texts, but his approach was always psychological rather than devotional. He read Eastern teachings as descriptions of psychic processes, as sophisticated maps of consciousness. He valued them for their phenomenological accuracy, their careful observation of states of mind. But he did not believe the Western psyche could simply adopt Eastern practices without consequences. In his foreword to D.T. Suzuki's Introduction to Zen Buddhism, Jung warned that Westerners attempting Zen practice might be bypassing rather than confronting their unconscious. The Eastern methods, he suggested, were developed for Eastern psyches, structured differently by culture and history. The Western psyche, shaped by centuries of Christianity, was more individualistic, more focused on moral conflict and the problem of good and evil. To simply adopt meditation practices without accounting for these differences risked creating a spiritual persona that covered over unresolved complexes rather than addressing them. Ram Dass, in his early teaching phase, was not much concerned with these cautions. He was offering what had worked for him, practices to quiet the mind, open the heart, dissolve the boundaries of the separate self. He taught meditation in universities, prisons, churches, living rooms. He spoke with humor and intimacy about his own struggles, his continuing neuroses, his relationship with his guru, his sense that despite all the spiritual experiences, he was still Ram Dass, still working with the same patterns and habits Richard Alpert had struggled with. This honesty about the gap between realization and actualization became central to Ram Dass's teaching. He distinguished between his experience of unity consciousness in moments of meditation or grace and his daily personality, which remained anxious, judgmental, desiring. He called himself a card-carrying member of the human race, someone who had glimpsed the truth but had not permanently embodied it. This was disarming and refreshing. It suggested that awakening was not a single dramatic event that solved everything, but an ongoing process of remembering and forgetting, of touching the eternal and then falling back into time. Jung might have appreciated this realism. He too emphasized that individuation was a lifelong process, never complete, always deepening. His late works, especially Answer to Job and Mysterium Coniunctionis, showed him still wrestling with fundamental questions of meaning and suffering in old age. He did not present himself as one who had arrived, but as one who had engaged deeply and persistently with the psyche's mysteries. Yet the frameworks remained profoundly different. Jung's individuation was about integration, about bringing together the opposites within the psyche, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, personal and archetypal in a synthesis that honored both differentiation and unity. The goal was a paradox, to become more fully who you uniquely are, while simultaneously realizing your connection to the universal patterns of human experience. This required suffering, the holding of tension, what Jung called the transcendent function, which produces symbols that bridge opposites without collapsing them. Ram Dass's liberation was about recognition, about seeing through the illusion of separateness to the unity that was always already true. The practices were designed to shift awareness from identification with content to identification with context, from being a separate someone who has experiences to being the awareness in which all experience arises. This did not require synthesis of opposites, but a stepping back into the space that contains all opposites, the witnessing awareness that is prior to dualities. These are not merely different words for the same thing. They represent different goals and different anthropologies. Jung believed that human beings are meaning-making creatures, that we need narrative, symbol, relationship. To collapse into pure witnessing, awareness might bring a certain peace, but it could also lead to a detachment from life, from engagement, from the creative struggle that makes us human. Jung valued the productive tension of consciousness wrestling with itself, the ego's heroic effort to maintain its position while acknowledging something greater. Ram Dass and the traditions he represented saw this effort itself as suffering. The attempt to maintain a separate self-position, to forge an individual identity, to achieve and integrate all of this, was understood as the fundamental problem, not the solution. From this perspective, Jung's individuation might look like an elaborate way of reinforcing the ego, of giving the separate self a spiritual project that keeps it occupied while missing the radical simplicity of just being. These differing views become particularly vivid when we consider the role of psychedelic experiences in each man's understanding. Ram Dass came to see his early psychedelic experiences as genuine but incomplete. They were windows but not doors, glimpses but not stable realization. The drugs showed him that consciousness could be radically different, but they did not build the capacity to access and sustain that different consciousness. For that, practice was needed. Daily meditation, devotional exercises, selfless service, the cultivation of what he called witness consciousness. But Ram Dass never dismissed psychedelics entirely. He saw them as potentially useful for people stuck in purely materialist paradigms, for those who needed proof that consciousness was more than brain chemistry. They were, he said, useful for getting thrown out of your normal place, for seeing that the world you take as solid and real is more fluid than it appears. But he emphasized that the experiences themselves were not the point. Integration was the point. The slow work of embodying in daily life what you glimpse in altered states. Jung's position on psychedelics was more categorically skeptical. For him, the problem was not just that the experiences were temporary, but that they violated the psyche's natural timing and process. Archetypal experiences, when they arise spontaneously through dreams or active imagination or synchronistic events, come when the psyche is ready for them, when there is sufficient ego strength to contain and relate to them. To force such experiences chemically was to risk overwhelming the conscious personality, leading to inflation, where the ego identifies with archetypal contents and loses its grounding. Jung had seen patients who, after intense spiritual experiences, became grandiose, believing themselves chosen or enlightened, unable to function in ordinary reality. He had also seen patients who, after glimpsing the unconscious depths, became terrified, their sense of self fragmented. The gradual process of analysis allowed the ego to strengthen as it encountered increasingly powerful unconscious contents. It was like physical training, building capacity over time. Psychedelics, in this view, were like trying to lift too much weight before your muscles were ready. Injury was likely. Yet there is something Jung might have recognized in Ram Dass's descriptions of certain psychedelic experiences. When Ram Dass spoke of encountering a presence of unconditional love, a sense of being known completely and accepted completely, this has the quality of what Jung called the self. In Jung's understanding, The self is experienced as the God within, the imago Dei, the totality that includes and transcends the ego. Encountering the self brings a sense of homecoming, of being held by something infinitely larger yet intimately one's own. The difference is that Jung believed this encounter must be mediated through symbols and worked with over time. A dream of a Khand. Mandala, for instance, might herald the constellation of the self. But the work then is to understand what the mandala means, to paint or draw it, to let its meaning unfold through active engagement. The symbol is a living thing, a meeting place between conscious and unconscious. To have a direct, unmediated experience of the self might be overwhelming, like looking at the sun without protection. Ram Dass's path through Bhakti Yoga offered a different kind of mediation. Instead of symbols, there was the relationship with the Guru and with the divine forms of Hindu devotion. Ram, Hanuman, Krishna. These were not understood as mere symbols, however. In the devotional traditions, the divine form is understood as a manifestation of the Absolute, a way the formless takes form to allow relationship. The devotee cultivates love for the form, and through that love, the heart opens to the formless. This is closer to the Christian mystical tradition than to Jung's analytical psychology. Jung studied Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart and Jacob Boehme with great interest. He saw in their writings sophisticated psychological insights, but he read them psychologically, not devotionally. Where Eckhart spoke of the birth of God in the soul, Jung understood this as the constellation of the self in consciousness. The language was religious, but the phenomenon, in Jung's view, was psychological. Ram Dass and the traditions he drew from would reverse this. What Jung called psychological, they would call spiritual. The self that Jung described was not merely an archetype or a psychic structure, but the Atman, the true self that is identical with Brahman, the absolute ground of being. To realize the self was not a psychological achievement, but a spiritual awakening to what has always been true, that your deepest identity is not a separate creature, but the divine itself, playing at being human. This raises one of the most profound questions in the dialogue between Jungian psychology and Eastern spirituality. Is the experience of ultimate reality psychological or ontological? Is the self an archetype within the psyche, or is it the ultimate nature of reality itself? Jung, trained as a scientist and a physician, was careful to claim only that he was describing experiences of the psyche. He did not claim to know what lay beyond psychic experience. His epistemology was phenomenological. We can only know what appears to consciousness. Whether there is a reality independent of consciousness, and what its nature might be, was not something psychology could determine. Ram Dass, following his guru and the Vedantic tradition, made an ontological claim. Consciousness is prior to matter, prior to the body, prior to the brain. The brain is not the source of consciousness, but the instrument through which consciousness manifests in physical reality. When the body dies, consciousness does not end. It returns to its source and eventually manifests in new forms. This cycle continues until liberation, when the soul recognizes its true nature and merges back into the Absolute. Jung was agnostic about such claims. He worked with patients' experiences of past lives or spiritual realms as psychic realities, meaningful contents that needed to be integrated, but he did not assert their metaphysical truth. In his late work, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung wrote that he could not say whether the soul continues after death, but he felt sure that the psyche behaves as if it does. producing symbols and images of continuity and transcendence. This caution, this restriction to the phenomenal realm, frustrated some of Jung's followers who wanted him to be more explicitly spiritual or religious. It also frustrated his critics, who accused him of smuggling metaphysics into psychology through the back door. But Jung maintained his position. He was a psychologist, describing the structures and dynamics of the psyche. That the psyche produced religious experiences and symbols was undeniable. What these experiences and symbols referred to beyond themselves, Jung would not claim to know. Ram Dass had no such hesitation. He taught, with the confidence of direct experience, that you are not your body, not your mind, not your emotions, not your thoughts. You are the awareness in which all of these appear. This awareness is eternal, unchanging, and ultimately identical with the divine. To realize this is the purpose of human life. All suffering comes from forgetting this truth, from identifying with the temporary vehicles of body and mind as if they were your true nature. This teaching offered immense relief to many who encountered it. The relentless pressure of Western individualism, the demand to achieve, to build a successful self, to manage one's emotions and optimize one's life could be set down. You are already whole, already complete, already free. The work is not to become something you are not, but to remember what you have always been. Yet there is a shadow side to this teaching, which critics have pointed out and which Ram Dass himself later acknowledged. The emphasis on detachment from thoughts and feelings, on witnessing them without identification, can lead to a subtle dissociation, a split between awareness and embodied experience. People can use spiritual practice to avoid rather than work through psychological wounds. The calm of meditation can cover over unresolved trauma. The teaching of "I am not my thoughts" can become a way to bypass the difficult work of understanding why certain thoughts and patterns persist. This is what psychologists have called spiritual bypassing, a term coined by John Welwood in the 1980s. Welwood, trained in Buddhist meditation and in Western psychology, noticed that many practitioners used meditation to avoid dealing with relationship issues, childhood wounds, and emotional needs. They could achieve impressive states of calm and even glimpses of non-dual awareness while remaining emotionally immature or relationally dysfunctional. Jung's method, with its emphasis on shadow work, was specifically designed to prevent this kind of bypassing. Before turning toward the heights, Jung insisted, one must descend into the depths, the shadow. All the qualities we have denied and repressed must be confronted and integrated. This is dirty work, humiliating work. It means owning one's aggression, one's envy, one's petty cruelties and secret shames. Only an ego that has done this work, Jung believed, has the strength and humility to approach the self without inflation. Ram Dass's later work showed an evolution toward acknowledging these complexities. In the 1990s and early 2000s, his teaching became more psychologically nuanced. He acknowledged that spiritual practice could not bypass psychological development, that the ego needed to be understood and worked with, not just transcended. He began to integrate more Western psychological concepts into his spiritual teaching, recognizing that his audience, shaped by Western culture and psychology, needed both paths. The psychological work of understanding and integrating the personality, and the spiritual work of recognizing what lies beyond personality. In his book, Still Here, published in 2000, Ram Dass reflected on his experience of a severe stroke in 1997 that left him with paralysis and aphasia. The stroke was, he wrote, a challenging teacher, stripping away capacities he had relied on, forcing him into a new relationship with limitation and suffering. The man who had taught about transcendence of the body found himself trapped in a body that would not obey. The teacher of letting go had to let go at a level he had not previously experienced. In this later phase, Ram Dass's teaching took on a quality Jung would have recognized, a both-and rather than either-or. Both the spiritual and the psychological, both. Transcendence and embodiment, both the witness and the participant. The stroke forced Ram Dass into the body, into the particularity of his condition, into engagement with physical therapy and the grief of loss. The lofty space of witnessing awareness did not remove him from suffering, but changed his relationship to it. Jung experienced something similar in the last decades of his life. After a heart attack in 1944, Jung had a series of near-death visions, experiences of traveling through space and encountering luminous reality. He returned to life reluctantly, feeling he had glimpsed something far more real than earthly existence. Yet he continued to live, to write, to work with patients and ideas for another 17 years. His late work shows a man holding the tension between this world and what lies beyond, between the claims of time and the pull of eternity. Both men, in their final years, embodied a quality of having touched something absolute while remaining thoroughly human, still engaged with the messy particulars of life. Ram Dass, paralyzed and struggling to speak, continued to teach through his presence, demonstrating that awakening does not mean the end of difficulty but a different way of meeting it. Jung, in old age, still wrestling with theological questions and alchemical texts, showed that individuation does not culminate in serene certainty, but in deeper questions and more complex paradoxes. The difference in their paths can be illuminated by looking at how each understood the relationship between ego and what lies beyond ego. For Jung, the ego is necessary and valuable. It is the seat of consciousness, the agent of will, the locus of identity. Individuation does not destroy the ego, but transforms it. The ego learns to serve something larger than itself, to listen to dreams and intuitions, to honor the archetypes, to orbit the self. The metaphor is political. The ego shifts from being an absolute monarch to being a constitutional executive, powerful within its domain, but acknowledging its limits and its relationship to a larger system. For Ram Dass, following Hindu and Buddhist teachings, the ego is ultimately illusory. It is a useful construct for functioning in the world, but it has no ontological reality. The sense of being a separate self, located in a body, distinct from others and from the world, this is Maya, illusion. Awakening is the recognition that the ego is a thought, a habit of identification, not a thing. What you truly are is the awareness in which the ego appears, the consciousness that observes the thought of I without being identical to it. These are not just different theories. They lead to different practices and different experiences. Jungian active imagination invites the ego to interact with unconscious figures. You might encounter, in imagination, a wise old man or a dangerous animal. The practice is to dialogue with these figures, to ask them questions, to listen to their responses. This strengthens the ego's capacity for relationship while opening it to contents beyond its control. The ego remains the center of consciousness but becomes porous, able to receive messages from the depths. Ram Dass's meditation practice, in the forms he taught, invites awareness to disidentify from thoughts and sensations. You observe the breath, or repeat a mantra, or simply watch thoughts arise and pass. When you notice you have been caught in a thought, believing it, identifying with it, you gently return to witnessing. Over time, this creates a gap, a space between awareness and the contents of consciousness. You begin to experience yourself not as the thinker, but as the space in which thinking happens. Each method develops different capacities. Active imagination develops the symbolic imagination, the ability to live with ambiguity, the capacity for inner dialogue and meaning-making. Meditation develops concentration, equanimity, and the ability to rest in awareness without being pulled into identification with mental content. There is overlap, of course. Both practices cultivate a certain kind of attention, a quality of presence. Both can lead to encounters with what Jung called the numinous, experiences of awe and mystery. But the interpretive frameworks are different, and the frameworks shape the experience. If someone doing active imagination encounters a luminous figure, Jung would ask, "What does this figure want from you? What is its message? How does it relate to your current life situation?" The figure is treated as real, autonomous, worthy of respect and engagement. The experience becomes material for psychological work, for understanding the psyche's current movement and needs. If someone meditating encounters a luminous figure, Ram Dass might ask, "Who is aware of this figure?" The instruction would be to observe the experience without attachment, to notice that awareness is prior to the vision, that the vision arises and passes while awareness remains. The figure is not denied, but is contextualized within the larger space of consciousness. The experience becomes an opportunity to deepen the recognition of awareness itself. These different approaches reflect different assumptions about the nature of psyche and the goal of spiritual or psychological work. Jung believed that the psyche has an inherent teleology, a drive toward wholeness and meaning. The symbols that arise in dreams and active imagination are not random, but purposeful, pointing toward what needs to be integrated or realized. The work is to follow this thread, to interpret and embody the symbols, to allow the individuation process to unfold. Ram Dass, and the traditions he drew from, held that the ultimate nature of mind is already perfect, already free, already enlightened. The problem is only that we do not recognize this. The work is not to achieve or develop something, but to remove the veils of ignorance, to stop believing in the illusion of separateness, to rest in what has always been true. For Jung, symbols mediate between conscious and unconscious, between human and divine. A dream image of a golden bird, for instance, is not merely a sign pointing to something else. It is a living reality, a manifestation of psychic energy, worthy of contemplation and engagement. Working with the image over time, through painting or writing or active imagination, allows its meaning to unfold and its energy to be integrated into consciousness. For Ram Dass, all forms, including symbolic ones, ultimately point back to formless awareness. The golden bird might arise in meditation, beautiful and numinous. The instruction would be to appreciate it, witness it, and let it go, returning attention to the awareness that perceives it. To become fascinated by the form, to dwell in it or try to extract meaning from it, could become a subtle trap, keeping attention focused on content rather than context. These differences are not merely theoretical. They have practical consequences for how one lives. A Jungian approach emphasizes engagement with the world, with relationships, with creative work. The individuation process unfolds through living, through facing conflicts and making choices. The goal is not to escape the world, but to be more fully present to it, informed by depths that give life richness and meaning. A Ram Dass approach emphasizes detachment, witnessing, the cultivation of what Buddhism calls equanimity. This does not mean withdrawal from the world, but a different relationship to it, meeting life's experiences without being identified with them, responding from awareness rather than reacting from conditioning. The goal is freedom, the ability to be with whatever arises without suffering from it. Yet in his later teaching, Ram Dass increasingly spoke of the importance of love and service, of opening the heart as well as quieting the mind. His guru's primary teaching was about love, about serving others as manifestations of God. This introduced a dynamic element into what could otherwise become a static detachment. Love pulls us toward others, creates engagement, involves risk and vulnerability. You cannot love from pure witnessing alone. Love requires participation, identification, the willingness to be affected. Jung, too, emphasized that psychological work must lead to ethical engagement, to what he called the moral task of individuation. It is not enough to have realizations or achieve states of consciousness. The question is how these transform one's actual life and relationships. Do you become more honest, more compassionate, more able to bear your share of the world's darkness? Jung's late work on the problem of evil, particularly in answer to Job, showed him struggling with how to reconcile the numinous power of the self with the reality of unjust suffering. Individuation, he concluded, involves becoming conscious of one's own capacity for evil and choosing, consciously, to constrain it. Ram Dass's teaching on service, on karma yoga, reflects a similar recognition. His guru told him that the best sadhana, the best spiritual practice, was serving others. Feed people, the guru said. Love everyone. Tell the truth. Simple instructions, but profound in their implications. Service keeps spiritual practice grounded, prevents it from becoming narcissistic or escapist. When you serve others, you cannot maintain a position of detached witnessing. You have to get involved, to care, to act. There is a beautiful convergence here, where the psychological and the spiritual meet. Both Jung and Ram Dass, through different paths, arrive at the recognition that transformation of consciousness must include transformation of character, of how one acts in the world. Both saw that genuine psychological or spiritual development produces humility rather than grandiosity, compassion rather than judgment, engagement rather than escape. Their methods for arriving at this are different. Jung's path emphasizes shadow work, confronting the denied aspects of oneself, owning one's darkness. This is humbling work that deflates the ego's pretensions. Ram Dass's path emphasizes devotion and service, practices that soften the heart and shift focus from self-concern to care for others. Different means, but similar outcomes. A person who is more human, more available, less defended. We might imagine a conversation between them, Jung in his study in Bollingen, his stone tower retreat, surrounded by books and manuscripts, and Ram Dass in his ashram in Maui, surrounded by students and flowers, the sound of the ocean nearby. What would they say to each other? Jung might begin by asking Ram Dass about his guru. Tell me about this man who could take massive doses of LSD without effect. What was his psychological structure? How did his consciousness operate? Jung would be genuinely curious, seeking to understand the phenomenon psychologically. Ram Dass might smile and say, Maharaji was not a psychological phenomenon. He was a being who had realized his true nature. He was awareness itself, taking form in a body, but not identified with it. Psychological categories could not contain him. Jung would nod thoughtfully. Yes, he might say, but even awareness taking form must have structure. Even the most realized being has a particular character, a way of manifesting. What archetypes constellated around him? How did he function as self for those who came to him? There, Ram Dass might say, is the difference between us. You see the self as an archetype, a structure within the psyche. I have experienced it as the ground of being itself, not a pattern, but the source of all patterns. When I was with Maharaji, I felt I was in the presence of something that was both utterly personal, he knew everything about me, and utterly impersonal, he was serving something that had nothing to do with his personality. Jung might respond, this is what I have tried to articulate as the paradox of the self. It is both the center and the circumference, both most personal and most transpersonal. When the self constellates, it feels divine. It has the quality of the absolute. But I maintain that this is a psychic experience. I cannot say what it refers to beyond the psyche. Perhaps it is the divine. Perhaps it is simply the psyche's deepest structure. I must remain agnostic. Ram Dass might lean forward. But Carl, why remain agnostic? You have felt it. You have experienced what you call the self. You know it is not a construct but a reality. Why not admit that it is God, that the psyche opens onto something infinite? Because, Jung might say, if I make that claim, I am no longer doing psychology but theology. And because the moment I name it God, I have limited it, placed it within a particular religious framework. Different cultures experience the divine differently. The psyche, in my understanding, produces images and experiences that reflect cultural and individual context. The Hindu experiences Atman and Brahman. The Christian experiences Christ and the Holy Spirit. The Buddhist experiences emptiness and Buddha nature. Are these all the same? Or are they legitimately different experiences of different aspects of the transcendent? Or are they different psychic structures producing different religious experiences? I do not know. So, I stay within my competence. I describe what appears in consciousness. I do not claim to know what generates it. Ram Dass might be quiet for a moment. Then he might say, I respect your caution, but for me, the experience was so direct, so undeniable, that I cannot maintain that distance. When I am in meditation and the sense of separate self dissolves, I am not having a psychic experience that I then interpret. The interpretation falls away along with everything else. There is just awareness, being itself, and it is obvious, self-evident, that this is what I truly am, what everything truly is. Jung might reply, yes, and when you return from meditation, you are Ram Dass again, with a body and a personality and preferences and habits. The experience of unity passes. How do you understand that? Is Ram Dass an illusion that periodically reasserts itself? Or is Ram Dass real but not ultimate. This is the problem of integration I have tried to address. The numinous experience is real, but it must be related to ordinary consciousness, to the ego that goes on living in the world. Ram Dass might nod. Yes, and this is the work, is it not? The oscillation between form and formless, between the absolute and the relative. My guru used to laugh at my questions about this. He would say, "It's all one," and then turn and tell someone what to do with great specificity. He lived in both dimensions simultaneously, or perhaps beyond both. Jung might smile. That is the integration I have called the union of opposites. But I maintain it is an achievement, the result of psychological work. Your guru, no doubt, had his own history, his own process of development. He was not born realized, even if he gave that impression. Here Ram Dass might tell Jung about the Hindu understanding of avatars and realized beings, of those who have completed many lifetimes of practice and return to teach. Jung might listen with interest, treating this as mythological material, as a narrative structure through which certain experiences are understood. They might never fully agree, but the conversation would be rich, each illuminating what the other cannot see, each offering perspective the other lacks. One area where their approaches might find common ground is in the understanding of suffering and compassion. Jung's later work, particularly his wrestling with the problem of evil and suffering in Answer to Job, shows a man trying to reconcile the numinous power of the divine with the reality of innocent suffering. He concluded that God needs human consciousness to become aware of God's own shadow, that the incarnation of Christ and the continuing incarnation in human individuation serves the divine's own development. This is a radical and even heretical idea within Christianity. It suggests that God is not complete, not perfect, but evolving, and that human consciousness plays a role in that evolution. Jung saw the persistence of evil and suffering in the world as evidence that the divine itself contains darkness, that the self is not purely light but includes shadow. The work of individuation, then, is not just personal but cosmic. By becoming conscious of our own darkness and choosing not to enact it, we contribute to the transformation of the divine. Ram Dass, from the Vedantic perspective, would see suffering differently. Suffering arises from identification with the body and mind, from the belief in separateness. When you know yourself as awareness, suffering does not touch you. You witness pain but do not suffer from it. This can sound cold, like a dissociation from embodied experience. But Ram Dass always emphasized that witnessing does not mean not caring. You can be fully present to someone's pain, fully compassionate, while not being overwhelmed by it. The compassion, in fact, is purer because it is not mixed with your own fear or aversion. Jung might respond that this sounds like a defense against being truly affected by suffering, one's own or others. To be human is to be vulnerable, to be touched by pain, to suffer when those we love suffer. This is not a problem to be transcended, but the condition of love. The work is not to escape vulnerability, but to develop the capacity to bear it, to hold suffering consciously without being destroyed by it or fleeing from it. Ram Dass would likely agree that compassion involves being present to suffering, not avoiding it. But he would maintain that the deepest compassion comes from a place beyond suffering, from the awareness that knows, even in the midst of pain, that something in us is untouched, that our true nature is free. This knowledge does not diminish care for others, but allows us to serve without being overwhelmed, to be present to others' pain without drowning in it. Both men, in their own ways, We're trying to address the question of how to be with suffering, one's own and others, without being destroyed by it or defending against it. Jung's answer involved symbolic work, finding meaning in suffering through the symbols and narratives the psyche produces. Ram Dass's answer involved recognizing the context of awareness in which suffering appears, a space large enough to hold pain without being defined by it. These are not opposing answers, but complementary ones, meaning making and spacious awareness, symbol and witnessing, narrative and presence. Each addresses something the other might miss. Jung's emphasis on symbol and meaning prevents the spiritual path from becoming dissociative, keeps it connected to the particular, to story, to the imagination. Ram Dass's emphasis on awareness and presence prevents the psychological path from becoming lost in analysis, trapped in endless interpretation, never arriving at simple being. In practical terms, someone working with trauma might need both approaches. The Jungian work of understanding how trauma affects the psyche, what images and narratives arise from it, how it can be integrated into one's life story, this is crucial. But so is the cultivation of present moment awareness, the ability to observe traumatic activation without being swept away by it, to find the stillness beneath the storm. Trauma work that integrates both dimensions, psychological understanding and meditative awareness, is more complete than either alone. This synthetic approach has become more common in contemporary psychology and spirituality. Many therapists now incorporate mindfulness practices into their work. Many meditation teachers acknowledge the importance of psychological understanding. The division between East and West, between psychology and spirituality, that was so stark in Jung's time and even in Ram Dass's early teaching, has softened. We are learning to hold both, to see them as addressing different but related dimensions of human being. Jung and Ram Dass were both pioneers in this integration, though they came from opposite directions. Jung brought Eastern ideas into Western psychology, showing that what the East called spiritual truths could be understood as psychological phenomena. Ram Dass brought Eastern practices to the West, making them accessible to people shaped by Western psychology, acknowledging that psychological work is part of spiritual development. Their legacies continue to influence how we think about consciousness, healing, and transformation. The Jungian tradition, now over a century old, has evolved but remains centered on Jung's core insights about the collective unconscious, archetypes, and individuation. Contemporary Jungians work with dreams and active imagination, continue to explore myth and symbol, and apply Jung's ideas to contemporary issues. Ram Dass's teaching, too, has continued to evolve and spread. The mindfulness movement, while rooted in Buddhist rather than Hindu traditions, carries forward the emphasis on present moment awareness and witnessing consciousness that Ram Dass introduced to many Westerners. His books remain widely read, his recorded talks widely shared. The Love Serve Remember Foundation continues to make his teachings available. What both demonstrate is that there are multiple valid paths to psychological and spiritual development. There is no single right way to approach the depths of consciousness. Different people, at different times, need different practices and frameworks. The contemplative might be drawn to meditation and witnessing. The imaginative might be drawn to dream work and symbol. The devotional might be drawn to prayer and relationship with the divine. The intellectual might be drawn to understanding and interpretation. Jung and Ram Dass each carved a path through the wilderness of consciousness. Jung's path is structured, careful, attentive to the dangers of inflation and psychosis. respectful of the ego's need for stability while opening it to transformative encounters. Ram Dass's path is more radical, willing to deconstruct the ego, to risk disorientation for the sake of liberation, to surrender control in favor of grace. A person might follow one path exclusively, or might move between them at different life stages. Someone might begin with Ram Dass, drawn to meditation and the promise of awakening, only to discover that psychological material keeps arising that needs to be addressed through methods more like Jung's. Or someone might begin with Jungian analysis, working with dreams and integrating shadow material, only to reach a point where they need to develop witnessing awareness and step back from identification with psychic contents. The oscillation between engagement and detachment, between working with content and resting in awareness, between psychological and spiritual, is itself a productive rhythm. Neither pole alone is sufficient. Pure psychological work can become lost in the complexities of personal history, endless analysis of patterns and traumas, without finding the freedom that comes from recognizing awareness itself. Pure spiritual practice can bypass developmental needs, leaving psychological wounds unhealed and patterns unchanged beneath a veneer of calm. The integration of both is challenging because the frameworks can seem contradictory. Jung says, strengthen the ego, make it flexible but stable. Ram Dass says, see through the ego, recognize it as illusory. Jung says, engage with symbols, let them unfold their meaning. Ram Dass says, let go of content, rest in awareness. How can you do both? The answer may lie in understanding these as complementary movements in a larger process. There are times to strengthen the ego, to develop its capacities, to integrate shadow material, and there are times to relax the boundaries of ego, to open to something larger, to rest in awareness. There are times to work with symbols, to let them speak and unfold, and there are times to let symbols pass, to recognize the awareness that perceives them. A mature practice, whether we call it psychological or spiritual, includes both movements. It knows when to engage and when to release, when to interpret and when to simply be, when to work with content and when to rest in context. This requires discernment, the wisdom to know what is needed in a given moment. Jung spoke of this as the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to move between opposites, to hold tension until something new emerges. Ram Dass spoke of it as skillful means, the ability to use different practices and perspectives as appropriate to circumstances. Both recognize that rigid adherence to any single method or theory eventually becomes limiting. There is a teaching story from the Zen tradition that might illuminate this. A monk asks the master, "What is the most important teaching?" The master replies, "Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water." The teaching is that awakening does not remove you from ordinary life, but changes your relationship to it. You are still living, still engaging with tasks and relationships, but from a different center. Jung might say that individuation leads to the same place. You are still yourself, still dealing with your particular circumstances and personality, but informed by depths that give life new meaning. The individuated person has not transcended their humanity, but has become more fully human, more conscious, more whole. Ram Dass would agree that realization does not end ordinary life. You still have a body with needs, a personality with habits, but the identification shifts. You know yourself as awareness manifesting as this person rather than as a person occasionally having glimpses of awareness. The center of gravity moves. These might be descriptions of the same transformation seen from different angles, or they might be different transformations, related but distinct. Jung's individuated person and Ram Dass's realized being would look similar in many ways, both grounded, present, compassionate, with a sense of connection to something larger than themselves, but their internal experiences might differ. The individuated person feels themselves as a unique center of consciousness in dialogue with the collective and the archetypal. The realized being feels themselves as awareness itself, taking temporary form. In the end, perhaps the question of which description is more true is less important than recognizing that both paths lead to greater wisdom, compassion, and freedom. Both Jung and Ram Dass dedicated their lives to alleviating suffering and expanding consciousness. Both developed methods that have helped countless people. Both struggled with the limitations of language to convey what they had experienced and understood. As we lie here in the dark, letting these ideas wash over us like waves, we might feel the pull of both orientations. Part of us wants to understand, to interpret, to make meaning of experience. This is the Jungian impulse, the drive toward comprehension and integration. Part of us wants to let go, to rest, to stop trying to figure everything out. This is the Ram Dass impulse, the invitation to simply be. Both are valid. Both are, in different ways, relaxing. To make meaning of suffering is relieving. To let go of the need to understand is relieving. To engage deeply with symbols is enriching. To rest in awareness is refreshing. We need both nutrients, both kinds of restoration. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, you might experiment with both. Notice the thoughts arising, the memories and images that float through consciousness. You might, with Jung, ask what they mean, what they are trying to tell you, what part of yourself is speaking through them. Or you might, with Ram Dass, simply watch them arise and pass, noticing the awareness that observes them, the stillness that remains while thoughts move. Neither approach is wrong. Both are ways of being with experience. As you hover between waking and sleeping, you have access to both the symbolic imagination Jung valued and the witnessing awareness Ram Dass cultivated. The hypnagogic state, the threshold between consciousness and unconsciousness, is where dreams form, where the psyche speaks in images, and also where awareness becomes most spacious, least fixed. Let yourself be curious about your own depths. What wants to be known? What images arise? And who or what is aware of these images? Both questions are worth asking, though they lead in different directions. One leads inward, into the rich complexity of psychic contents. The other leads, in a sense, backward or beyond, to the ground of awareness itself. Jung and Ram Dass would each want us to find our own way, to discover what practices and frameworks serve our development. Jung created a method but insisted it must be adapted to each individual. Ram Dass shared what had worked for him, but encouraged each person to find their own path to God, to truth, to awareness. Neither was dogmatic, though each had deep convictions. What they share, perhaps most fundamentally, is a conviction that human beings are capable of transformation, that we are not fixed, but fluid, not determined, but free to choose how we relate to our experience. Whether we call this transformation, individuation, or awakening, whether we achieve it through analysis or meditation, through symbolic work or devotional practice, The possibility itself is the good news they both proclaimed. The psyche is deeper than we think. Consciousness is more spacious than it appears. We are not confined to the narrow stream of ordinary awareness and identity. We have access to dimensions that are collective, archetypal, transpersonal, spiritual. We are capable of growth, healing, and profound realization. This is what both men discovered in their own ways and spent their lives trying to communicate. As sleep approaches, as consciousness begins to shift and soften, you are crossing the threshold Jung studied and Ram Dass pointed toward. Sleep is a return to the unconscious, a nightly dissolution of ego boundaries. In sleep, you dream, and in dreams, the psyche speaks through images, just as Jung described. In deep sleep, dreamless sleep, there is only awareness without objects, the state Ram Dass called the I am, without content, pure being. You move through these states every night, dying to the day's concerns, dissolving into the larger psyche, and being reborn each morning. This nightly cycle is a microcosm of the larger transformations Jung and Ram Dass addressed. Every sleep is a little death. Every waking is a little birth. Every dream is a message from the depths. Every awakening is a return to the task of living consciously. Jung saw dreams as letters from the unconscious, communications that need to be read and answered. Ram Dass saw waking life as a dream from which we can awaken, a constructed reality that seems solid but is actually fluid. Both perspectives have truth. Dreams do communicate if we learn their language. And waking life is, in a sense, a dream, a construction of consciousness that we mistake for absolute reality. Tonight, let both be true. Let your dreams speak to you, as Jung suggested, bringing messages, showing you what you have not yet integrated, offering guidance and compensation. And let yourself recognize, as Ram Dass taught, that awareness witnesses both waking and dreaming, that something in you is always awake, even in sleep. This is the witness, the observing presence, the consciousness that is prior to all states. Perhaps this is where Jung and Ram Dass most closely meet, in the recognition of a presence that observes, a center that is not caught in the stream of contents, a self that is both deeply personal and transpersonal. Jung called it the self. Ram Dass called it awareness or consciousness. The names differ, but they may be pointing to the same mystery, that there is something in us that is greater than our ordinary identity, something that connects us to larger realities, something that is the source of wisdom and wholeness. To close the gap between these two perspectives completely might be impossible. The frameworks are rooted in different philosophical traditions with different assumptions about the nature of reality. But to hold both perspectives, to move between them fluidly, to use each where it is most helpful, this is possible and perhaps ideal. When you are caught in psychological suffering, when old wounds are activated, when you are reactive and identified with painful emotions, the Jungian approach offers a way forward. Understand the pattern, trace it to its roots, see what archetype is constellated, what complex is activated, what shadow material is being projected. Work with dreams and symbols. Bring consciousness to what has been unconscious. This is the way of integration, of making the unconscious conscious. When you are stuck in analysis, when the mind is spinning with interpretation, when you are exhausted by self-examination, the Ram Dass approach offers relief. Stop trying to figure it out. Come back to presence. Notice Awareness itself. Let the story be without needing to resolve it. Rest in the spaciousness that holds all stories. This is the way of release, of recognizing what is already free. Different moments call for different medicine. Sometimes we need to go deeper into content to understand and integrate. Sometimes we need to step back from content to rest and just be. A wise approach to inner work includes both movements, both capacities. The people who sought out Jung in his consulting room were often successful, educated, accomplished in outer life, but feeling empty or conflicted within. Jung helped them discover that there was an inner world as rich as the outer, that their dreams and fantasies and symptoms were not meaningless but full of significance. He taught them to attend to this inner world, to take it seriously, to engage with it. This gave their lives depth and meaning. The people who sought out Ram Dass in the 70s and beyond were often seeking something similar, meaning depth, freedom from the superficial. Ram Dass offered a different path, not deeper into the psyche, but beyond it, into awareness itself. He taught them to watch their thoughts rather than believe them, to question their identity rather than polish it, to open to a dimension of experience that was always present but usually overlooked. Both were responding to the spiritual hunger of their times, the sense that material success and social adjustment were not enough, that human beings need connection to dimensions that transcend the everyday. In Jung's time, this hunger was emerging as people became disillusioned with traditional religion, but were not satisfied with purely secular scientism. In Ram Dass's time, the hunger was intensified by the failures of materialism and the opening of Western culture to Eastern ideas. That hunger persists today. People still seek meaning and depth, still sense that there is more to existence than what appears on the surface, still want transformation and awakening. The methods Jung and Ram Dass developed remain relevant because they address real dimensions of human experience. The psyche does contain depths that become conscious through symbolic work. Awareness does have a spacious quality that becomes accessible through meditative attention. Both discoveries are valid and valuable. As you lie here, perhaps you can feel both dimensions, feel the richness of your inner world, the memories and images and feelings that make you who you are. This is the psychological dimension, the realm Jung explored. And feel the awareness that perceives all of this, the consciousness that is here before thought and remains after thought passes. This is the spiritual dimension, the realm Ram Dass pointed toward. Neither negates the other. You are both the person with a history, a personality, patterns and potentials, and the awareness in which all of this appears. To honor both is to be fully human. To neglect either is to be incomplete. Jung would not want you to bypass your human particularity in pursuit of abstract awareness. He would say, engage with your life, your relationships, your work, your suffering. Find the meaning in it. Let it transform you. Bring consciousness to your darkness. Become more fully yourself. Ram Dass would not want you to be trapped in the endless complexities of psychological analysis. He would say, wake up from the trance of identification. Remember who you really are. Rest in presence. Serve others. Love everything. Be here now. Both invitations are worthy. Both paths lead somewhere valuable. And both men, in their own ways, embodied what they taught. Jung lived a full, engaged life. Married, a father, a physician, a scholar, a writer, building his stone tower, tending his garden, wrestling with ideas and experiences until his death at 85. Ram Dass lived a simpler life after his transformation, teaching, serving, traveling, writing, growing old gracefully even as his body failed, demonstrating presence and humor until his death at 88. They showed that the path of transformation is not an escape from life, but a deepening of engagement with life. The individuated person and the awakened being are not removed from the world, but more fully present to it, less defended, more available, more real. As you continue to relax, to let go of the day, to allow sleep to come in its own time, you might offer gratitude to those who have explored consciousness before us, who have mapped the territories we now traverse. Jung and Ram Dass are two such explorers, two guides whose work remains available, whose insights continue to illuminate. You might also recognize that you are an explorer too, that each life is a unique journey through consciousness, that your dreams and experiences and realizations are part of the larger human story. Jung collected myths and dreams from his patients and from world cultures, showing how the psyche works across time and place. Ram Dass shared his own journey and the teachings he received, showing that transformation is possible, that suffering can end, that love is the answer. Your own experience is data, not in a scientific sense, but in a sacred sense. Your life is a manifestation of consciousness exploring itself. Your dreams are messages. Your insights are revelations. Your struggles are the material of transformation, whether you work with them psychologically or spiritually, whether you seek to understand or to transcend, whether you follow Jung or Ram Dass or find your own way entirely. The journey itself is the point. There is no final destination, no arrival where all questions are answered and all work is done. Jung knew this. In old age, he was still questioning, still exploring. Ram Dass knew it too. Even after decades of practice and teaching, he still encountered his own neuroses, still worked with patience and humor on himself. The journey continues until it ends with death. And even then, both men suggested, it may continue in ways we cannot know. Jung was open to the possibility of life after death, to reincarnation, to the psyche continuing beyond the body. Ram Dass was certain of it, having been taught and having experienced in meditation what he believed was awareness of dimensions beyond the physical. But here, now, in this body, in this moment, the question is simpler: how to be present, how to be conscious, how to meet what arises with wisdom and compassion. This is the practical work both traditions point toward. This is what matters in the living of life. And so, as you settle more deeply, as breathing slows and thoughts become less sticky, as you cross the threshold into sleep, you carry with you the gifts of these two teachers. From Jung, the understanding that your psyche is meaningful, that symbols guide, that transformation comes through integration of opposites. From Ram Dass, the recognition that you are awareness, that presence is always available, that love is the ultimate practice. Let these ideas dissolve now into the background, becoming not thoughts but presences, invisible companions as you descend into sleep. Let Jung's wise old man walk with you through dreams, offering guidance in image and symbol. Let Ram Dass's guru bless you with laughter and love, reminding you that it is all here, all now, all one. The dialogue between them continues not in words, but in the living of your life, in the moments when you choose to reflect on an image or let a thought pass, when you engage with a symbol or rest in awareness, when you work to integrate your shadow or simply watch it without judgment. There is no resolution to their differences because the differences are not problems but perspectives, different views of the same mysterious reality we call consciousness, psyche, soul, awareness. Each view reveals something the other might miss. Each path has its wisdom and its limitations. You need not choose between them. You can be a both-and rather than an either-or person. You can value depth psychology and meditative awareness, symbolic work and presence, individuation and awakening. You can read Jung's Red Book and Ram Dass's Be Here Now and find nourishment in both. The modern world offers access to wisdom traditions that were once separate. We can learn from East and West, from ancient and contemporary, from scientific and spiritual sources. This is a privilege and a challenge. The privilege is the richness of resources available. The challenge is integrating them coherently, not just collecting techniques and ideas, but weaving them into a life that has integrity. Jung and Ram Dass both valued integrity, the word that comes from integer, wholeness. Jung's individuation aims at integrity, at becoming a whole person. Ram Dass's awakening aims at integrity too, at recognizing the wholeness that was always already true. Wholeness is not perfection. Both men had shadows, blind spots, areas where they struggled. Jung could be difficult in relationships, arrogant at times, trapped in the prejudices of his era. Ram Dass had his own challenges with sexuality, with authority, with the gap between teaching and embodiment. Neither was a saint or a perfect sage. They were human beings who went deep and shared what they found. This is encouraging because it means transformation is for humans, not for perfect beings. You do not have to be without flaws to do this work. You do not have to resolve everything before beginning. You start where you are, with whatever consciousness you have, and you gradually develop, opening to more, becoming more aware, more integrated, more free. The work is gradual, as Jung emphasized, proceeding at the pace the psyche can handle, but it can also have moments of sudden opening, as Ram Dass experienced, where something shifts and you see from a completely different perspective. Both are true. Transformation is mostly slow and incremental, and occasionally there are breakthroughs, discontinuous leaps. Be patient with yourself, then, as you would be patient with a child learning to walk. You will fall. You will forget. You will get identified and reactive and lost in story. And then you will remember. You will practice. You will find your way back. This is the rhythm of the path, whether psychological or spiritual. Jung would tell you to pay attention to your dreams, to keep a journal, to engage in active imagination, to notice what activates you and ask what you are projecting, to honor the archetypes and seek their wisdom. This is good counsel. Ram Dass would tell you to meditate daily, to watch your mind, to return to the present moment again and again, to serve others, to open your heart, to remember you are awareness, not ego, to love everything. This too is good counsel. Perhaps the synthesis is this: do the practices that help you wake up and the practices that help you grow up. Meditation helps you wake up to awareness beyond ego. Psychological work helps you grow up, to become a mature, integrated person. Both are needed. Waking up without growing up can lead to spiritual bypassing. Growing up without waking up can lead to a well-adjusted but unawakened life. The ideal, which neither Jung nor Ram Dass fully articulated but which their work together implies, is to wake up and grow up simultaneously, to become more conscious psychologically and more awake spiritually, to integrate shadow and rest in awareness, to engage with symbols and recognize the witness, to be fully human and more than human. This is the invitation at the deepest level, the call that comes from the self, from awareness, from the mystery that we are. It is the call to be conscious, to wake up from the trance of automatic living, to take responsibility for our inner world, to see through the illusions, to recognize what is real and what is real. Jung would say, the psyche is real, symbols are real, archetypes are real, meaning is real. Ram Dass would say, awareness is real, consciousness is real, love is real, the present moment is real. They are both pointing to dimensions that are more fundamental than the surface play of daily life, more enduring than passing thoughts and moods. These dimensions are accessible. They are not far away or reserved for special people. They are here, now, in you. You can encounter an archetype in a dream tonight. You can rest as awareness in this very moment. The resources for transformation are built into consciousness itself. You do not have to import them. You have to learn to recognize and work with them. This recognition, this learning, is the work of a lifetime. It is also the gift of a lifetime. To live consciously, to engage one's depths, to know oneself as more than a social role or a collection of habits, this is to live richly, meaningfully, fully. This is what both men promise in their different ways. As you hover now at the edge of sleep, as the boundaries between inner and outer grow soft, as consciousness prepares to shift into the dream world and then into deep sleep, you might recognize this transition as sacred. You are letting go of ego control, surrendering to a process you do not direct. Sleep takes you whether you consent or not. Dreams come without asking permission. You release into something larger. This is good practice for the larger surrenders life requires. Ultimately, we must surrender to aging, to change, to death. These are not failures, but the conditions of existence. Jung understood this. His late works grapple with aging and mortality, with the meaning of death and what might lie beyond. Ram Dass understood it too. His later teachings, especially after his stroke, addressed disability and dying, meeting them with as much presence and humor as he could manage. To live consciously is to live with awareness of impermanence, with acceptance of limitation, with gratitude for the brief, mysterious gift of existence. Both men cultivated this awareness in their own ways. Both found that facing impermanence and mortality opened them to deeper dimensions of meaning and presence. You do not have to resolve all questions tonight. You do not have to achieve anything. The invitation is simpler. Rest. Be here. Allow sleep to come. In sleep, the psyche will do its work, processing the day, weaving images, sending messages. You do not have to direct this. You can trust the process. Jung trusted the psyche's self-organizing capacity. He saw it producing symbols of wholeness, mandalas, and quaternities, even in people who knew nothing of such things. The psyche, he believed, has an intrinsic drive toward healing and integration. You can cooperate with this drive, but you do not have to force it. Ram Dass trusted awareness itself, the consciousness that is always here, always whole, never damaged, regardless of what happens to body or mind. This awareness, he taught, is your true nature. You do not have to achieve it or become worthy of it. You simply have to recognize it. Both forms of trust are valid and valuable. Trust that the psyche is working toward wholeness. Trust that awareness is always here. These are not opposed, but complementary, different angles on the same basic faith, that there is wisdom and healing available, that we are not abandoned to chaos, that consciousness has depth and resources we can draw on. So rest in that trust. Let Jung's certainty that the psyche has purpose and Ram Dass's certainty that awareness is ever present hold you as you drift. You are held by something larger, something wiser, something that has guided human beings through darkness for millennia. The darkness of sleep is not empty. It is full of potential, of dreaming and deep rest, of healing and integration. The darkness returns us to source, to the unconscious from which consciousness emerges each morning. This is the cycle, the rhythm, the pattern Jung studied and Ram Dass lived. Each night is a return, each morning is a new beginning, each sleep is a death, each waking is a resurrection. This happens naturally, effortlessly. You do not have to work at it. You simply have to allow it. And in the allowing, there is grace. Grace is Jung's word for what happens when the self intervenes, when the larger psyche offers help that ego alone could not produce. Grace is Ram Dass's word for the unearned blessings that flow from being open to the divine. Both men believed in grace, in help from beyond ego, in resources that come when we stop trying to do everything ourselves. Tonight, receive grace. Receive the grace of rest, of sleep, of dreams, of the unconscious. Receive the grace of awareness, of presence, of the breath moving without effort. Receive the grace of existence itself, the unlikely miracle that you are here, conscious, alive. Jung and Ram Dass, different as they were, both point to the same ultimate gesture, a relaxation into what is, an acceptance of life as it comes, a surrender to processes larger than ego. Jung called it submitting to the self. Ram Dass called it surrendering to God. The words differ, but the movement is the same, letting go of the illusion of total control, trusting something larger, opening to grace. This is the final teaching, the one that words can only approach. It is lived, embodied, experienced, rather than understood. It is what happens when you stop resisting and allow life to move through you. It is the peace that comes not from resolving all questions, but from resting in the mystery. So rest now in the mystery. Let Jung's symbols and Ram Dass's presence surround you like a gentle darkness, holding space for sleep and dream and renewal. Let their wisdom settle into your bones, not as doctrine but as possibility, not as answers but as invitations to explore your own depths in your own way. The path is yours to walk. The practices are yours to choose. The integration is yours to live. But you do not walk alone. The ancestors of consciousness, the explorers who have gone before, walk with you, their insights available, their methods offered, their encouragement given. Sleep well, then, knowing you are part of a great lineage of seekers, a long tradition of those who have asked the deepest questions and sought the fullest life. Sleep well, knowing that the work continues in sleep as in waking, that the psyche never rests in its movement toward wholeness, that awareness is always here. Sleep well, and in the morning, when you wake, you will bring back something from the night, some dream or insight, or simply the restoration that comes from having rested, and you will continue the great work, the opus, the journey toward becoming more conscious, more whole, more awake, more alive. This is the promise and the path. This is what Jung and Ram Dass together offer, a life of depth, of meaning, of consciousness, of presence, a life that honors both the human and the divine, both the particular and the universal, both the psychological and the spiritual, a life that is, in the fullest sense, awake. Welcome that life. Welcome sleep, welcome dreams, welcome awareness, welcome the mystery, welcome yourself, exactly as you are, on this journey that has no end but infinite depth. Welcome, and rest, and be.